Okay, then it's just be me starting.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Doolin, and I'm back, and I'm here with Jeff Tretsven, and he is a nonviolent communications coach. We did a previous video where we introduced him and talked a little bit about nonviolent communications, and now he's going to do teaching for us on nonviolent communications. So, Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Glad to have the opportunity.
So you're going to show us a presentation, so I'm going to switch the view so that we're back to you, and I'll let you take it over from now. And I'll ask some questions as you go along.
Okay, and well, but the magic of nonviolent communication is the joy of contributing. And if you want to, if you just think of how you feel when you contribute to somebody else, if you can think of something over the last 24 hours, last week, or whatever, where you've made somebody's life more wonderful, and then you've contributed to somebody, and how does that feel when you think about contributing to somebody? And I think that's just the most wonderful feeling there is, knowing you've contributed to somebody else. And that's the kind of the magic that drives NVC, is people love to contribute to each other. The only thing is, if we don't ask them in a way that they like to hear, then they don't want to contribute. And I think most of the time people aren't asked in a way that they really want to contribute. And do you have any comments?
No, I'm just gonna watch. Thank you.
Okay, and one of the things with nonviolent communication, the name Marshall Rosenberg, the man that came up with it, I think he really would have liked to have called it ahimsa communication, but very few people would have known what that meant. So he went with nonviolent communication, which is the English translation. But it doesn't translate very well in English, because in English it sounds like just the avoidance of physical violence, but it actually means total nonviolence, no physical violence, and no passive violence. And passive violence is kind of things are in our speech that are violent that we're not even aware of. I mean, most people are kind of shocked when they hear about how they've been talking. It would be described as violence, and sometimes I'm almost reluctant to bring it up because it almost turns people off, because they don't like hearing that something they've been doing all their life isn't what their intention was.
Well, here I want to actually make a comment, because ahimsa is one of the yamas, and yamas or niyam, right? It's one of the yamas. So there's 8 limbs of yoga, and one of them, and two of them are the yamas and the niyamas. And the niyamas are things that you should try to do, and the yamas are the things that you should try to avoid. Ahimsa, one of the yamas, is one of the things that you should avoid, which is that you should avoid violence in your, not only in all of your actions. And I know that you mentioned that you practice ahimsa also in your eating, and so you're vegetarian, which is
vegan.
You're vegan.
Yeah.
So that's one of the traditional practices of yoga, is to be, a vegetarian. Usually people, Hindus practice ovo-lactate vegetarianism. They eat eggs and they eat milk, but they don't eat animal flesh. So ahimsa, I really thought that this idea of violence in speech is something that I haven't really heard about in yoga. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how you're defining that the way that we're speaking is actually committing a violence.
Okay, so there's a professor at the University of Colorado, O.J. Harvey, and he did this study on how often the verb is used to make a judgment in a language or in a culture, and also in other languages that's used in a similar way. And there are some languages where the verb is not, they don't have the verb is that's used to make a judgment. But he found out the more often in literature that the verb is used to make judgments, the more violence there was in that culture, that there's a direct correlation. And so what I'm talking about is like basically putting labels on things. Like maybe like we talked about racist before. So if you call somebody a racist, that would be considered what I would call the use of a label in a violent way. And also labels that we think are kind of neutral, like calling somebody a cook, their profession, because when some professions there might be stereotypes about them, and so by calling them, saying somebody, defining somebody by their occupation is not who they are. It's just what they do to earn money. And so there's a difference between this is a person who performs cooking duties and this person is a cook. And that's where we're using it as a judgmental kind of label.
And so you're actually striving to erase the word is from your vocabulary?
Not completely use the word, but use it where it's used to make a judgment, like as in assigning a label or making a diagnosis, or something like saying, Suzanne, you're too sensitive, or something like that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting though what you said about like a cook or something like that, because when I lived in Washington, D.C., many people define themselves by their careers. And then when I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, it was interesting that nobody defined themselves by their careers. And you would ask people, tell me about yourself. They would talk about, more about just the things that interested them, but they didn't talk about their careers. They didn't consider that to be their defining characteristic. And it's interesting to hear how you think about, these definitions actually are a way of not really seeing the full person.
Right. So I'm sure like an accountant, people have a stereotype of, accountants are, they're stuck in logic or something like that, and they're not very warm people. I'm just making up something, but that's kind of hints at something we don't think is harmful, but it actually can be when you prejudge somebody just based on what their occupation is.
It's honestly, I have done that, and it's one of the things that I've been really working on actually here in this group and also in my business dealings, is understanding that, there are people who are accountants who actually, they're so passionate about what they do and so loving in what they do. And I had been really afraid of a lot of these business-like professions because I associated them in a negative way. And part of my mission is to say to people that really need this help in order to do their work on this planet of yoga, nonviolent communications, all the things that we're doing, that, you need to stop. So you stop labeling those people, because not only are you harming them, but you're also harming yourself, because you're not seeing the person that's there in front of you that could actually really help you to do your important work, because you're afraid of them.
Right. And our language is so embedded that to try and, overnight get rid of all labels in our language, it'd be, you probably almost couldn't talk to anybody anymore. So it's not so much I would say to eliminate them from your language, but just be aware of them. And so you don't fall in the trap of, that you have a story about this occupation and therefore you're already judging this person based on your story and not who they really are.
So like many practices of mindfulness, where you're sort of removing yourself into that witness consciousness and you're noticing those judgments, maybe you're not necessarily not using them anymore, but you're being aware of how they're affecting you.
Right. And to be aware, you have to realize what they are. And they're so pervasive in our language, we're not even aware when we do it.
I bet a lot of people who are watching are sort of shocked to be hearing this definition of violence and speech as just labeling people, or labeling. And I think the racism in particular very relevant, not only to, Martin Luther King Day, but also to what's the discussions happening in our culture right now.
Right. So it's so saying somebody makes remarks you don't like, and then that they don't meet your need for like equality, is very different than calling somebody a racist. Right. And that's what we want to get to, is that it's their remarks we don't like, and then what's the reason behind that we don't like them, and that's that because we value respect, consideration, equality, love, whatever it is.
That's really beautiful. It seems like from there, you actually could have a real conversation with somebody. Whereas if you just said, well, you're a racist, then you need to back them right into a corner.
Well, that's pretty much the end of the conversation. If you call somebody a racist, I would assume. I mean, you're probably not going to get anywhere from that point on.
Okay, I'm going to let you keep going with your presentation since we're still just on the first slide. We want to share a little more.
Okay, but and then Gandhi translates ahimsa as love. That's really important. It's when there's so much love in your heart, you wouldn't think of harming anyone or anything. That's really what ahimsa is. Okay, then NBC has a couple questions we like to ask ourselves. So what's alive in us? And these are would be what we're like observations, what we get through our five senses, and mostly with our interactions with other people is what we see or hear. And then how we feel about it. And that's an emotional word, not like saying things like I feel like, or which is really when you say I feel like, you're about to express a thought. So to be able to be good with observations and feelings, you need to be able to separate out your thoughts from the observations and feelings. And I found this is quite a challenge for most people. And if you don't have a good feelings vocabulary, then you might be limited to like I feel good or I feel bad, which is a start. Then at least you know whether it's kind of met needs or unmet needs. And then your needs are what is, that's what you want. Their needs are always kind of the positive, universal things. They're peace, love. Of course, you have your basic needs like water and shelter. And the list they have on the Center for Nonviolent Communications website is basically comes from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that. And there's been some arguments about how, if there truly is a hierarchy or not. And to me, it's not like a rigid hierarchy, but there are definitely needs that are more important than others.
Sure. I mean, I think that if you were to talk with people about, a need for food or water, shelter, over some, a need to like be heard. It's like, yeah, being heard is important, but, like having basic nutrition sort of trumps that first.
Right. But if something comes up that's really important, then maybe being heard is more important than eating in the moment. And it's flexible. It's not, like I said, it's not rigid.
I also would like for you to define needs, because one of the things, like when I first started this, is it's sort of like, oh, I need a car. We use that term in ways, but that's not really how they're defining needs. Like a car is a strategy for getting a need met, but the need behind that is simply, like transportation, or a need for, being able to, have a certain amount of freedom, or a need for, work. The fundamental need is not the car. So.
Right, and it'd probably be better to start at the beginning with observations to say, so observations are extremely specific. You want your observations to be about a specific time and date. You don't want them to be general at all. You want it, the more specific, the better. And then when you get to feelings they're very general. Everybody has the same feelings. Everybody gets angry. Everybody's happy, sad, irritated, annoyed, frustrated, excited. They're common to everybody. And then needs are the same way. They're real general. And needs are universal to all human beings. And there are things like love, peace, harmony, respect, consideration, growth, learning, integrity, honesty. And we've mentioned like food, water, shelter, safety from dangerous animals. And so the way you can tell if it's a need or not is if it's universal, and if it has any specificity about it, then it's not a need, it's a strategy. So if a person's involved, like if you say, I need you to love me, then it's no longer, you're not using the need the way nonviolent communication would use the word need. You're using it in a different way. And
so
that's let's
do, like, for an example, I might say, like, when, as an observation, I might say, like, when I practice nonviolent communications with Jeff, then I feel happy because it's meeting my need to be heard. And so the observation is like when, it's telling the specific event. And
well, you'd want it to be more specific. Like, so when I practiced last Wednesday with Jeff, and so you'd want to be real specific. Because when you say when I practice with Jeff, then it's kind of general.
It's too general. So I would,
Right.
a really good observation would be like last Wednesday when I practiced nonviolent communications with Jeff at 8 p.m. I felt happy and it helped me to meet my need to be heard.
Right. Yeah, and when it's a positive emotion, then do you say those three things. So when you like somebody's behavior, you say what you observed, how you feel about it, and what need was met. But if it's behavior you don't like, then you'd say, what the observation was, and then the negative emotion, and then your need that wasn't met. And then you'd want to finish it with, well, what would make life more wonderful? What's my request here? And this is where, to me, this is where the challenge is you're busy figuring out what's my observation? What's my feeling? What's my need? And then you want to immediately come up with, well, what do I want this other person to do differently, and frame it in a positive way, what I do want, and be real specific and concrete. And so sometimes it's good just to ask them, have the request be, what did you hear me say? And so you can hear if they heard it in nonviolent communication language, or if they heard it kind of in the judgmental language. So if you ask them, what did you hear me say? And you say, well, you think I'm a real jerk. And then you want to say, well, thank you for letting me know what you heard. Let me try again. I wasn't as clear as I'd like to be. And then they might be ready to hear you the second time.
And I also think that there was a point that's sort of in there, which is that when you're feeling and your feelings are negative, your feelings are, they're not feelings that make you feel like your needs are being met. That's an indication that to you that a need is not being met, and not necessarily because what typically happens is that when we have those negative emotions, then we blame the other person for being a jerk or being, thoughtless or whatever. And instead, this focus is, well, I'm not happy with what they're doing. And then what is that telling me about the need that I have that's not being met? And taking that focus away from their need to fulfill your need, like this other person having this role of fulfilling your needs without you ever identifying what they are.
Right, and where your feelings actually come from is your thoughts. So when you observe something you don't like, then it's your judgmental thoughts about the person is where your negative emotions come from. And some people don't like using the term negative emotions because it implies emotions are bad. And I like the term negative because it's like a wake-up call to me when I experience a negative emotion. Hey, there's something going on here that I want to pay attention to. I'm thinking in a way that's not in harmony with my values. So like if I was thinking somebody's a jerk and I feel angry, and I can say, oh, it's my thinking he's a jerk is where my anger is coming from, not so much the behavior.
Excellent.
And I don't want to discourage like that you don't like anything. It's like you're talking about, some people think it's about being nice, and it's not about being nice, it's about being real. So like if somebody did something to another person in front of you, I would want you to feel those negative emotions. But then by getting in touch with your negative emotions, saying, well, what do I really want here? If I want respect or consideration, then my telling the person they're a jerk or whatever, that wouldn't be coming out of my wanting respect or consideration. That would be coming out of anger. So if I can get in touch with respect and consideration first, and then talk to the person, I'm much more likely to say something connecting than if I go directly from anger to talking. And I think that's where most of our problems are. We go straight from the negative emotion to expressing something. And then what comes out is not connecting at all. And so this is about being aware of, well, what's important here. And then once you're aware of that, the behavior that you exhibit becomes very differently than if you don't have that awareness of what are my needs here.
Okay, so let's keep going with what you're saying. I think we covered, feelings, needs, observations, and then requests.
Okay.
The basic skills of nonviolent communication. So tell me about these two questions for requests that I'm seeing on the slide.
Okay, so the two questions we want to ask ourselves when we do requests is, well, what would we like people to do differently? And like I said, we want to state this in a positive way. And then the second one is, why do we want them to do it And we want the answer to the second question to be that they want to enrich life and not out of fear, punishment, guilt, or obligation. And if anybody can, probably almost everybody, I'd assume, if they go back to their childhood, they were told to do it because I said so or something like that. And when you do that, it's not fun to do it.
Right.
Whereas if maybe if you didn't like doing the dishes but you like mowing the lawn, and then you made an agreement with your parents, well, I'll mow the lawn and somebody else can do the dishes, then you're happy mowing the lawn. Or maybe it's really important to your parents that you do the dishes or whatever, and they explain to you that how they want everybody to have equality and take turns and to share and contribute. And maybe after being explained that, maybe you say, oh yes, I would like to have it be a valued member of the family and do contribution. Then you might enjoy doing the dishes.
Yes, I hear exactly what you're saying. And I think particularly in relationships with children, a lot of people feel like the only way to get what they want is to just sort of order them around, which in my experience doesn't work. Fortunately, I was gifted with a child who absolutely refused to to be ordered around in any way, shape, or form. And so I had to learn how to communicate much differently because she just was born very strong in herself. And I was very fortunate to have to learn how to do this. But I know a lot of parents really don't quite know, how to express to their children, like, I have a need that needs to be met, and this is what I want from you. And instead they sort of, use that power position to dominate them. And I don't think either person particularly likes that relationship. But many parents that I've talked with seem kind of, that's how they were brought up, and so that's how they knew to do it. And I don't think it really sets up a great relationship long term with your child. Personally,
no, it's like the corporal punishment. There's still people that firmly believe that corporal punishment is the way to do so. And they even have in like Texas, they still have like wooden paddles with holes drilled in them so that they can hit the kids harder. And what they found, there's only one benefit to corporal punishment or spanking, and that's short-term obedience. And is that really what you want? Do you want short-term obedience? That means as soon as your back's turned, they go back to doing what you don't want them doing.
Well, and the other thing that happens is that when you raise a child to be compliant, then they grow up to be a compliant adult. And then, that's not necessarily a good thing to have a person who's raised to be compliant, because that person is vulnerable to being manipulated.
Well, you get a resentful adult.
Okay, so let's keep going. I'd like to keep it moving along because we would like to not keep the video too long for people.
Okay, and we've kind of went over this, so maybe if people want to review it, they could practice it or pause it and then review it. And except for number 5, we haven't gone over. So if you make a request and somebody says no, this is probably one of the most challenging parts of nonviolent communication, is being able to switch over to empathy and guess what's going on for them, what their reasons are for not wanting to do as you requested.
This particularly interests me about nonviolent communications, because what this number 5 is talking about is that the other person doesn't have to be skilled in nonviolent communications for you to actually use these skills. That you can actually sort of, in your mind, be running their dialogue as if they were actually doing the skills. So
right, you translate it.
It's somebody, like if somebody's coming at you and they're like, you're such a jerk, blah, blah, blah. And in your mind, you're thinking, what need is this person trying to express right now? Just doing the skill, it helps me to like break away from my knee-jerk reaction to like, oh, you think I'm a jerk? No, you're a jerk, like, it gives you another way to think about when somebody's throwing themselves at you and making you feel, like, oh, I don't have any choice. It gives you this ability to step back and see them with compassion.
Right. So then instead of just seeing it as a light or fight, flight, or freeze, there's a fourth option, and that's connection. So nonviolent communication, we would choose connection instead of the previous three. And this takes a lot of practice. It's not like you suddenly say, well, I'm going to just choose connection, and then somebody out of the blue says something to you, and you go to it. You need to, if you don't practice it frequently, then you'll just go back to, what your comfort level is, which is to just do back to them what they just did to you.
I'll tell you one thing that I've learned with this particular skill is that when people are so used to, if they kind of if they start sort of judging you, that you're going to react, and that if you break that cycle, a lot of people feel very uncomfortable with it. And so, and also it can make you sort of come off as a little sort of dispassionate in a way, because you're not, like you're not being so emotional, and you're kind of like, oh, are you expressing a need for this? And so this skill to me is challenging to do and to maintain the connection to the person.
Well, it's really important to have a really good feelings and needs vocabulary to do this, so that you're genuinely saying feelings and needs. And you don't use the word feeling and need when you say it to them. Otherwise, they kind of start hearing, oh, he's playing psychologist with me.
Right.
So there's a trick to it of speaking in a way that you don't sound like you're doing anything, and it takes a lot of practice to be fluid at it. And a lot of times, just the pauses of thinking, people get upset when you like stutter or pause, and they don't like that. And I find it kind of humorous when you get two people who are both learning nonviolent communication, and then the one person is kind of irritated by the other one not being proficient in it, and it's just kind of. I find humor in any way. They probably don't think it's too funny when they don't.
Because they're struggling with it. So yeah, and so that comes up to a thing that this is a skill, and it's a difficult skill, and you have to practice it. And so, to learn this kind of this method, there's such a learning curve, because it's so different from the normal way that we speak. And so you have to learn all these skills, not only of just doing the skills in a sort of controlled environment where other people understand that you're trying it, but also then figuring out how do you talk to normal people in a normal conversation and yet still practice these skills in a way that can be done in a way that they, that you can actually start to affect a change in the conversation away from violence and into true listening, true empathy.
One thing I found works really well is being really honest about what I'm doing and saying, are you okay if I talk nonviolent communication with you? And then a lot of people are usually curious, well, what is it? And then once you explain it, or I explain what it is, then they're like, sure, that sounds good to me. And that helps too. Then they don't think I'm playing some kind of game with them, that I'm just being open and transparent. This is what I'm doing.
Yes, I think I've seen I'm in a beginner, nonviolent communications group, and a lot of people have said people think I'm playing some kind of weird game with them because I'm not good at it yet. So just, I think for people who are watching, like, it's good to know that, like, these skills, they're skills that you learn, they're skills that you practice. And like I said, when we first started talking, that seeing you made me realize, like, it is possible to get to the point where you're fluid with it. It's like any skill. Most people just don't think that they have to learn how to talk, because we've been doing it our whole lives. And I think that's the hardest part, is recognizing that the way that we've been brought up to talk, most of us, is not loving.
Right. And it's just like if you were learning skateboarding, you wouldn't go out to the skateboard park on your first day and try the most difficult tricks, even though it looks easy on TV when the experts are doing it. You practice just your balance and trying to go in a straight line, and then you do it. Whereas because everybody speaks, they think they can go to the most difficult part because they speak every day. And I've had the people not be interested in it because they weren't able to be experts at it immediately. And that's kind of a disappointment for me, because I'd really like to see people. There's so much I get out of this, and I'd like to see other people get what I've got out of it.
Okay. Okay. So let's keep going with the presentation. And
Okay, and here's Marshall Rosenberg, and he's the man that came up with nonviolent communication. He died about 3 years ago, and I'd gone to an international intensive training with him, and then I came back as an organizer 6 months later. So I got to work with him quite a bit, and he's just amazing how that's just he embodies it.
he is also, there's many YouTube videos. Part of the Nonviolent Communications is that a lot of people really want to share this knowledge. And so if you go on YouTube, there's quite a few videos of him that have been shared. And there's actually a 9-hour formal training that's really laid out that is on YouTube. There's also really nice videos of him interacting with people. He is really phenomenal. There's such a presence about him, and just like when I work with you, I feel like when you see somebody who's really excelled, and there's something you hear in their voice that shows like a total difference in how they relate to people. It is really inspiring. I highly recommend for people to go and look for videos for Marshall Rosenberg on YouTube. I will put a few in the links here. To get people started so they can see what he was like. He was just amazing. You were so fortunate to be able to actually train with him.
Yeah, he's like one of my, I read a lot. I've read a lot of authors, and so he was the first author, that was pretty somewhat famous that I met. So it's quite an experience for me just to be there with, oh, here's my hero, and I'm in the same room with them.
I've had that experience with Eric Schiffman, my teacher, and when I first met him, I had that very same feeling, and I remember being kind of afraid when I first met him that he wasn't going to live up to all my expectations of him because I was so excited about his teachings, and what I learned was that he was the real deal, and I can tell that you had that same experience with Marshall, that he was genuinely a person who embodied his teachings.
Okay, and you can see he has his two mascots, the jackal and the giraffe, and that's kind of helps us with coaching when if we want somebody to practice nonviolent communication, we give them the giraffe. It seems to help them focus a little more and actually practicing the process. And so the giraffe speaks in nonviolent communication, and then the jackal speaks in the kind of our normal judgmental language.
So the jackal would say, "You're a racist." The giraffe would say, "Are you?" When I hear you, how did you say it? You said it so nicely before.
Okay, so well, I would say I start out with a feeling. So, are you irritated, or are you angry? Are you annoyed? Something like that. Whatever. I guess with racist, it'd probably be angry or outraged. And then if they agree to it, then I would guess at the need. And it's pretty much going to be respect, consideration, equality. Those are the things that really come up around the term racist or racism.
So the giraffe would not say you're racist. You'd be saying, are you needing respect?
Well, you wouldn't say, are you needing? Because then you sound like the psychologist. But you want to start out with the emotion first. So you'd want to ask, are you angry? Are you outraged? Depending on, how they're coming across. And you don't have to be perfect at guessing, but you want to be sincere as long as you don't sound sarcastic. So if I guess, are you irritated? And they say, no, I'm hurt. They're usually not upset about guessing wrong. And it actually helps them check in with themselves and what's going on for them.
So let's say, for example, that we were in that meeting with Trump, and he said, well, why would you want, immigrants from the shithole countries like Haiti? And how would you respond to something like that? When a giraffe, like what would be the jackal response? Is like, oh, that's a racist thing to say. And then the giraffe thing to say to something like that would be what?
Okay, when I hear the President of the United States say we don't want people from these shithole countries, then I feel disappointment, and I value respect and equality. So would you be willing to tell me what you heard me say?
Nice. And see, I feel like then there's there's an opening for a real conversation about what was said rather than sort of defensive.
Yeah, even the term disappointment can that can be a little stimulating. So I might use a better word than that, because usually when you're disappointed, somebody didn't live up to your expectations.
They hear a judgment with
Yeah.
the word disappointment, but still, it's a beginning, and it's something different from you're expressing a feeling rather than judgment. And so, if you were getting started and say that you were, say you have your racist uncle who comes to a meal, and they're saying something that is making you uncomfortable, instead of silently simmering, you can say like, oh, I'm really disappointed to hear you say that, or I'm upset to hear you say that, because I value, I value equality or treating people with kindness.
Right. And you said that he would make you upset, and he wouldn't make you upset. You'd choose to be upset. So that's just one of the things you want to be aware of when you're saying that we choose our, how we think. And it seems so automatic that it's easy to say things like, you make me angry. And it's actually, we choose to be angry because we value respect and consideration.
Exactly.
Okay, are you okay with being corrected? That's one of the problems of coaching nonviolent communication is how do you do it in a way that, people don't start judging themselves or feeling embarrassed or something when they make corrections.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, and so this is something I found that this is my view of nonviolent communication and trying to share it with the world, is the best tool for this job would be a hammer. And here's the guy using the back of a drill to try pound a nail in. And and when you tell people that what they're doing isn't working, a lot of times they hear like criticism, and it's just trying to let them know a better way. And it's so hard. How do I, let people know there's a better way without, kind of telling them, hey, you're doing something wrong here, which in nonviolent communication, when we talk about right and wrong, we're talking more about what works and what doesn't work, instead of like saying the guy's he's a bad guy because he's using the back of a drill to try to pound in a nail. He's just basically, he's ignorant, and not ignorant that he's stupid, just that he's not aware of, nobody's shown him a better way to do it, and so he doesn't know a better way. And I don't know, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do I, do this in a compassionate way, let people know what they're doing isn't compassionate, and it's been a real challenge for me.
I think that the best way that we show people the value is by modeling it. I remember I worked with a woman her husband was a preacher, and she had, this kind of very compassionate ability to listen. And I remember, just having had experiences of people who did that. It was really beautiful to watch people really be able to model compassion. And I don't know if we can tell people they're doing it wrong, but I think that we can show people that there's another way to be in our own behavior, and create an interest in discovering, well, how did they do that? I think letting people know that it's actually something you learned and not just something that you were born with. It's important.
And I had a really good example come up with this. I was doing a presentation at a bookstore, and there's a woman there who'd read the book, and she had a friend who was the owner of the bookstore, and the owner of the bookstore came in late, and she was willing to jump right in and put on the giraffe puppet and try it out. And so the woman who'd read the book had watched me giving examples of how it works, and she thought to herself, well, I can do that. That looks pretty easy. And then the bookstore owner with the giraffe puppet on, started trying to do it, and I was coaching her, okay, this is what you want to change this and change this. And then the other woman said afterward, you said, when you demonstrated, I thought I could do it. And then once I watched my friend try to do it, I realized, oh, it's not as easy as it looks. So there's more to this modeling it. People need feedback on actually try it out and get some kind of feedback of whether it's working or not.
I hope that people who are watching realize, like, there's another way to talk. There's another way to be. We don't have to judge everybody. And yet we can still get our needs met, because that's what scares people, is like, oh, if I'm not judging people, if I'm not telling them, what's bothering me, then how do I get my needs met? And in fact, maybe you're not even getting your needs met right now, actually, through this method of communication that you're using right now. So I think that it's really important that people know there is another way. It is possible to be empathic. It is possible to be non-judgmental, get your own needs met, and also to meet other people's needs. The tools that we have actually aren't effective. And I think it's actually when you hit that crisis point where you start to realize that your tools aren't effective, that you're open to learning something new. But,
right. And I want to, when you brought up judgments, we have a clear distinction about that. And we have two kinds of judgments. There's moral judgments, like somebody's a bad person or a good person based on their behavior, or maybe their position in society or whatever. And then there's the judgments we have in nonviolent communications. We make value judgments. Are our needs met? So was our need for respect met? Was our need for consideration met? Was the need for compassion met? And so we don't eliminate judgments. We just have a different type of a very specific kind of judgment. And the judgment,
evaluation than judgment.
Right. Well, so like if somebody does what would be considered racist behavior, then we kind of judge them as a bad person. But in nonviolent communication, that we judge that their behavior is not meeting our needs.
I see.
And yeah, at first when I learned this, that's what I thought, was that we don't have any judgments. And then I realized Marshall said that it's not that we don't have any judgments. We distinguish between the two different types of judgments.
Okay.
Okay, and this is kind of where I like to see with self-evaluation, if we don't know about something, they've done a study and they found out that people evaluate themselves very skilled at something if they don't know exactly what the process is, or they've never tried it. And a real good thing on this is that applies this is listening. When they do surveys and they ask people, are you good listeners? It's almost 100% of people who respond and say, yes, I'm a good listener. And then they ask, well, what percentage of other people are good listeners? And then the number will come back like around 25% to 40%. So there's obviously a difference between we evaluate ourselves and the way we evaluate others. And the thing with like listening skills is, how do you judge or evaluate how good a listener you are? And the real way to find out would be to ask the other person if they're skilled at, giving feedback in a way. And so it's kind of like you're shooting at a target, but you don't really know whether you're hitting it or not. So you just assume, well, I must be hitting the target because I'm not getting any feedback that tells me I'm not. And that's
if I was in a conversation with somebody, I wanted to learn whether I was actually, being a good listener for them. What are some questions that I could ask that would help me know if I'm hitting the target?
Well, you'd ask them their feelings and needs. And then they would now, and the way you tell you're really hitting the target is after you've been listening to them for a while, they calm down, their speech slows down, and they're much more. And if you're in a conflict with them, and then if they're ready to listen to you, and then you ask them, are you ready to hear what's going on for me? And then when you start talking, they stay calm, then you've really connected with them. If they start getting agitated again, then you want to go back to kind of focus on them and get to more feelings and needs.
This process really does take time. And I think that part of the reason that we don't aren't listening empathetically a lot of times is that we feel that time pressure and relationships. Then it does take time to actually get to really spend time with somebody and hear everything. You can't just do it like that. I can't do it like that yet.
Yeah, if you don't have the skill, it's not going to proficiency of the skill, it's not going to work. But once you are good at it, it actually saves a lot of time. Doing empathy, you'll spend a lot less time arguing and get right to the point than you will with, through arguing back and forth. And a lot of times with arguing back and forth, you just end up leaving, with it unresolved at the end, which means you've just wasted the whole time and haven't got any results.
Hang on one second, I gotta open the door. Hang on. Hey, Sean. I'm recording right now. Okay.
Hi.
Sorry.
Great semester.
Have a kid coming in the door.
Okay, it might be a good time
Yes,
to go to
I'm
the
back.
next slide.
Yes.
Okay, so when somebody does give you feedback that you don't like, you probably won't like it. And I know I did this joke in a social justice symposium, and nobody laughed until I said, I guess that was joke bombed, and then I got a good laugh. So I don't know if this is kind of stunned people or whatever, but the feedback is if you're not a good listener, is the other person stays irritated or frustrated or angry, and that conversation ends, and kind of that's with some, maybe one or both of you is still in some kind of negative emotion. And good feedback would be that you leave the conversation and you're both, in some kind of positive emotion where your needs have been met, you've been heard, understood, whatever it is you're looking for.
Okay. So part of the way that we can evaluate whether we're a good listener is simply by asking somebody what are your needs, and seeing if they're responding, if they're starting to slow down. And also you end up leaving that conversation feeling like it was productive instead of wanting to tear your hair out.
Right. So what everybody really wants, they think they want to be loved, but what people really want is they want to be loving. So when you practice nonviolent communication and you work to get everybody's needs met, then you feel good about yourself because you've demonstrated love. And that's what we really want, is to be able to demonstrate love.
Wow, that's really an amazing thing to think about that, because I think often that is that feeling that I have, that, I wanted to be loving and then I ended up being a jerk. And, it's hard to figure out, how did that go so wrong? I think many of us walk into conversations intending to be loving. So that's really, that's very insightful.
Right. And that's
so you're saying, when we have fruitful interactions and we feel that we were loving.
Right. We feel good about ourselves. It's easy to have self-love and self-acceptance when we've been kind to other people, when we've contributed to the situation instead of making it worse.
Nice.
And you brought up intention, so that's something that's really important to me, is the difference between intention and skill. And so just because we have the intention of being loving, if we're not skillful, then it doesn't help the other person. So we need both intention and skill to be truly loving.
Yeah. It's amazing that Marshall was able to come up with the system to actually literally teach the skills to be loving, and, to actually show people, this is how you begin and this is how you get there. Because how many of us have ever been taught how to speak in a way that's really, really loving? I think we learn it through, for me, I've done lots of therapy, which is a great skill, but it's not totally, it's useful to have some of those tools, but it's not exactly the same thing as being truly empathetic, because the goal of therapy is to discover things about yourself. So those tools can take you so far, but they're not the same. They're not really just skills for conversation.
Right. And Marshall, when he got his PhD, just before he graduated, a professor pointed out to him the limitations of pathology-based psychiatry or psychology. And so he was pretty disappointed to hear that right before he graduated. But he thought about that a lot. And when he was younger, he really was interested in what makes people compassionate and what makes people want to hurt other people. And that was kind of the focus of his life from a pretty young age. And so that's why he went into psychology, was to learn that. And then to hear that it wasn't what he really wanted to get out of it just before he graduated was pretty disappointing. And then in clinical practice, he didn't like the way it worked. And then he discovered somehow nonviolent communication. He found out with nonviolent communication, he could do in 3 sessions with somebody what would take him years of psychoanalysis to get the same results.
Incredible.
Yeah, and his mentor, Carl Rogers, said it did his studies, and it didn't matter, whether somebody studied Freud or Jung or whatever. It mattered how skilled they were at empathy, how much they helped the patient.
I think they've done studies of that on therapists where they show that, like, it doesn't really matter what the techniques are or whatever. It's really whether people actually felt like they got heard.
Right.
And there's all different kinds of, like, techniques, and I don't think that they've shown that any of the specific techniques are better than the other.
But see, that's the problem with nonviolent communication, is he developed it outside of the university system. So it's like the universities don't even know about it. And so to me, it's the most effective one, but it's not in they're starting to do it a little bit. It's getting into the universities, but it's really, the universities really don't teach much about it. In fact, that's where I've had people that have masters and PhDs in psychology things, and they can't, and ask them to express a feeling, and they'll use non-feeling words, and they'll point out, well, that's not really a feeling, and they're aware enough that they can say, oh yes, I see what you're saying, and then they will find a feeling word, but it's not part of their natural language to be aware of the difference between a feeling word and a non-feeling word.
Yeah,
and
it's
like I said,
I mean, it was shocking to me that when I started doing it, like, I don't know actually how to speak like this, and it's awkward, and you think like, oh, I must be using feeling words, but a lot of times I use feeling words I can identify other people's feelings, but to identify my own feelings actually much more challenging, and actually to do it in a fluid conversation, I often have to, like, look at a list of the words and be like, okay, what am I feeling? And I think, like, wow, I look like an idiot, but I'd rather do that than continue on with the violent form of speech that I had before.
Right, and to do that, you'd have to let the other person know what you're doing and that you're trying to create connection. And it's better if there's a little pause while you look at the word than that you use a judgmental word to describe their behavior.
Okay. I'm a little concerned about how long this is going, so I want to make sure that we get through all of the things, but I also want to make sure that the video isn't so long that people will feel like it's more than they can listen to. So
okay, and this is the last slide. So
okay,
and it kind of breaks out how the process works with the observation, feeling, needs, and requests, and then the 2 components of empathy and honesty. So honesty is saying what's alive in me, what I hear, what I feel, what I like, and asking the other person, would you be willing to do this? And then empathy is acknowledging what's going on in the other person, the same things, what's their observations, what's their feelings, needs, and requests. And then the most important one is, so there's actually a third part, is the self-empathy that goes on in the background, and that's just being aware of what's alive in me without expressing it to the other person. And this is something I try to just all the time try to be in self-empathy mode and being aware of, what's going on for me. And it's I think that's what, when people talk about masters, that they're very self-aware, and this is what they would be doing. They're aware of, well, what are their emotions and what are their needs.
Yeah, the self-empathy part is very interesting to me. And so I'll just say that from what I understand it to be is that, in order to actually be able to do this with other people, to be in empathy with them, then you also have to really kind of be able to keep yourself calm. And so you're also sort of, at the same time, there's almost like 2 conversations happening at the same time. One is with the other person you're in communication with, and then the other is sort of with your own psyche, where you're having this conversation about sort of like, well, what are you feeling? And you're keeping yourself calm so that you can truly be empathetic to the other person, because as they're triggering all sorts of things in you, then you have to sort of keep yourself fluidly feeling like, okay, no, I'm not going to react, and it's not like you're biting your tongue. You have to actually really, really keep yourself satiated. People know when you're not really, able to do it.
Right. You don't want to keep yourself from reacting. What you want to do is let them know when you're not able to be present for them and say, when you just said that, I'm so stimulated, I'm not able to be present for you. Would you give me a moment to get myself together? You can either do that quietly and stop listening to them for a minute and kind of tune out and then come back and hopefully you can catch up and didn't miss anything important. Or you can interrupt it and say, you know, or if it's big enough, you might want to say, I need to step out for a minute and then we'll come back in 5 minutes or something. And Marshall even did that when he was working with fathers that were accused of molesting their children. That, you know, somebody made the father made the comment that it's her fault, and Marshall said, you know, he excused himself and left the room and to calm himself down before he could come back and continue the conversation.
So even somebody as skillful as Marshall had times when he wasn't able to actually be able to be in empathy with someone because that's so difficult to hear something like that.
Right.
I worked on a listening hotline, and one of the things that we were asked about was, you know, like, were there people that you would just really not be able to hear empathetically? And generally the two answers were, you know, somebody who had hurt a child, and also people who were committing suicide or crime. That was very difficult for people to do, you know, listening with empathy. And some people really, sometimes if people actually had a relative or a friend who had committed suicide, it made it very, very difficult for them to be empathetic in that situation because it just created such strong feelings in them. And so we actually worked a great deal of time with people to help them to understand their own feelings around that before we would allow them to go onto the phones. Because like, I think we spent about a third of our time on suicide, even though only like 1% of our calls related to suicide, just because it was such a hot button issue for people.
Yeah, the big thing is being honest and letting them know when you're not able to be there.
I think we are afraid that people won't handle it if we let them know that we're struggling with the things that they're sharing with us vulnerably.
Yeah, and that's Marshall says that your safety lies in your willingness to be vulnerable. And it sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually true. It's once you show the person that you intend no harm, then they can feel safe around you. And so the way you do that is by being totally vulnerable.
So you said that this was the last slide, so I'm going to have you stop your screen share and come back on for a minute, and then, oops, there we are. Okay, and let me just change the view to side by side, and we want to wrap this up. So I want to tell you a little bit, we're talking about this for Martin Luther King Day. And so, one of the things that I kind of wanted to tie this back around to was, the work that was done with nonviolence in the South to bring about this change. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, where Martin Luther King marched. And as well, my grandparents lived in Montgomery, Alabama. My mother's best friend worked every year. She would do the March on Selma. They do it every year. They march across the bridge at Selma in order to remember that historic march. So all of those places are very much in my heart. And the work that he did, it literally changed the place that I grew up. And where I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, it was completely segregated in my mother's day. And now today, it's becoming more and more and more integrated, which was relatively a short period of time, a really incredible change in the community. These tools of nonviolent communication, I think they're so important for us to be able to really make real change, and instead of just backlashing against each other, creating ways for people to actually work together. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about work that was being done at this community level. We've talked so much about it at this sort of interpersonal level. Can you talk just a little bit about how these tools are used at a community level?
Well, the start of this was he ran a psychology clinic, and he actually had the biggest one in the country, and he was asked to help with mediating school desegregation in the South. And that's where this was born out of, was the desegregating schools, which was a pretty hot topic, back in the 60s. And I'm not sure if he actually worked with Martin Luther King or not. I know he had met the family after Martin Luther King wasn't around anymore. But Marshall's kind of modest, and I think he had more impact and more interactions than he admitted to. But yeah, this can be used in anything. I think it's pretty much what Gandhi would have really liked it and would have supported it, because it's very much, I think, the way Gandhi kind of spoke. Everybody was his friend, and you never saw an enemy. And that's kind of the way nonviolent communication talks.
And so he actually was able to take this. It wasn't just him and his, dealing one-on-one with people in a kind of psychological setting, but he was actually going into like organizations. I know in his book, or somewhere I was talking, he went into Chicago after there were several police killings and there was a lot of racial tension, and he went in and actually mediated between the police and some of the gangs, I guess, that were in the area that were involved in these shootings. So he did a lot to actually bring people together, groups of people together using these techniques so that they could hear each other and be willing to come together. So, I just think it's really important that people know that there are tools out there right now that can really change the world to make it a better place. And all the racism that Martin Luther King was fighting, that we also have tools to fight that in the present day. Because it is coming back around again. It's so, that the Charlottesville was such a shock to most people to see that really things haven't changed that much since King's Day. But we still have these tools that allow us to come together as humans to prevent violence.
Right, and Marshall's worked in some of the most violent places in the world. He was in Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics. He was in Israel between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He's in a civil war in Sri Lanka. He is in Africa between the Christians and the Muslims. And he is at one in Africa where everybody at the table had a close relative killed by somebody else at the table.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know exactly what it takes for people to come together when the violence has been so personal. But I'm really glad that you shared about that. And we're going to put some more links into him and those talks, that 9-hour talk. There is a 1-hour lesson where it really talks about specifically about these issues at a community level. So just to bring it back around to Martin Luther King Day and this kind of thing, it's like, yes, in our personal lives, we can be loving, but also there's this other level of conversation that we can be having that's at a, more of a community level too.
Okay. And it all begins with yourself.
Absolutely. Oh my God. So like yoga, it's a journey of a lifetime. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being here today and sharing with us about nonviolent communications. I hope that people become interested in it. We'll put a link to your website, compassionateinteraction.com, where is correct? Yes. Yeah. And Compassionate Interactions is Jeff's website. And if you're interested in learning more, working with him as a coach, or learning more about his work, that's where you can learn more. There's more information on his website about nonviolent communications. And we'll also put some links into some of the videos with Marshall Rosenberg. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Jeff.